Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we have an updated Pool 4 buying guide for the post-rotation Pool 4. We had our first rotation at the end of January, so cards like Shuri, Valkyrie, Bast moved on down, and now they're a bit more accessible, only costing 3,000 tokens instead of 6,000. So today we're going to go over this tier list I put together and which cards I recommend you buy, and maybe more importantly, why certain cards are or are not worth buying. So a little bit of a disclaimer here. We might notice that Shuri stands alone in S tier, and I want to mention how I kind of ranked these tiers here, because this isn't to be taken as power level tiers. I don't put the tiers the way I do here purely because of a card's power. There are more factors than that go into it, because I think there are more factors than a card's power when people are considering buying it. Though power is definitely a very relevant factor, of course. So what factors are we considering here? We're considering token value, for one thing. 3,000 tokens, while less than 6, is still quite a lot. So is it worth your buy? And then why is it worth your buy? What is this card doing that makes it worth those 3,000 tokens? So to rip the band-aid right off, all the cards on this list, if there is one card you buy on this list, it should probably be Shuri. That comes with a disclaimer though, that Shuri is really mainly used in one kind of deck. It doesn't see quite as much play in a variety of decks like it did pre-Zabu nerf, where you could just kind of throw it and Wong and other big things into a deck and cheat them out. She definitely is a bit more streamlined now to the big deck archetype, but that is shaping up to look like a very solid tier 1 deck, and more importantly, it is a deck that cannot function without Shuri. A big part of why I rated cards where they are is because they are essential to making a deck archetype work. Shuri can't really, the Shuri deck doesn't work without Shuri. It's just not even remotely the same. And so for that reason, I think she is the easiest and honestly probably the only card I think is absolutely without a doubt worth your 3,000 tokens for Pool 4. Now there are some disclaimers with that in if you are missing some of the Pool 3 cards that make Shuri good, most notably Red Skull and let's say She-Hulk as two of the big ones, Shuri might not be an instant buy for you because those cards are also required to make the deck work for her. That said, pretty much all the cards in the Shuri deck, aside from Shuri herself, are Pool 3 cards. So they are a bit more accessible. You can acquire them in the token shop if you are further away from finishing Pool 3, though I would generally avoid spending too many tokens on Pool 3 cards, as you will naturally reach Pool 3 conclusion eventually. But Shuri really stands out as the best card here, and that's why you can kind of see there's a gap between S and B tier. There is no card in the A tier, and that's not because some of the cards lower down aren't good, but it's because this is very contextual, and in the context of how the metagame is shaping up, I think Shuri is really the only card that stands out as you should really buy this card if you are interested in the archetype, because it's shaping up to be a top deck in the metagame. Now, let's talk about some of the other cards. So, Bast, moving down to B tier, and this is something I think applies to Bast, Valkyrie, and Black Panther. These are all cards that create a unique archetype that often cannot function without these cards in the deck. And that's a big reason why I put them where they are. I do think the power level of these cards generally is fairly high, though in the context of the current metagame, I'm not sure any of these cards really are going into a tier 1 deck, but it is a little bit early to say. We aren't sure what all the tier 1 stuff is yet, but things are starting to shape up, and it seems post-nerfs that Bast, for certain, isn't quite as A tier as it used to be. The main reason being, which decks does Bast get played in? And Bast is often played in Mr. Negative as the main archetype, but there are a few other ones that Bast sees play in, such as Zudex and sometimes Cerebro 3. Now, Negative was far and away the best archetype for Bast. However, that deck got hit pretty hard with the nerf to Silver Surfer, who we will talk about when we do our Pool 5 Buyer's Guide. But because of that, I think Bast gets a little bit of a downgrade here from where they would have been in A tier before. Now it's a bit more of a B tier card. However, that being said, just because a card is in B tier doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily buy it. There are more factors to whether someone wants to buy a card than is this card going to win me games. A big factor for a lot of players is wanting to play decks that do different things, to have a variety in the style of decks that they can play to increase their enjoyment with the game. A lot of people, myself included, like a variety of decks and don't really want to play the same deck over and over and over again. And that's kind of why all the cards in B tier are here, because all three of these cards, Bast, Valkyrie, and Black Panther, basically create archetypes that cannot function without them. Or if they can, they are not nearly as good. It just feels like a piece is missing if you cannot have access to them in the deck. Bast, for the decks I've already mentioned. Valkyrie is pretty good in Cerebro 3. Occasionally you'll see it in Zoo/Thanos lists, and there are even a few Valkyrie control style decks floating around. I don't think those decks are necessarily looking to be tier 1 so far, but wouldn't surprise me if they were tier 2 or maybe high tier 3, but they are decks that can get you wins and provide a unique playstyle, which is something a lot of players value. Black Panther kind of falls into a similar boat here, where he does enable a different style of deck. Obviously, he has nice synergy with Shuri, so he's kind of a bonus if you have access to her, and he does give a pretty big boost to the on-reveal style of deck. That really doesn't function quite the same without him. Also gives a boost to cards like Zola and Odin. So if that deck is more your speed, Black Panther is a pretty good option for enhancing what that kind of deck can do. That said, for all these cards, I think I would most likely wait unless one of these archetypes really speaks to you. If you're a dedicated Zoo player, or you're a dedicated negative player, Bast is probably a pretty good buy. Same with Valkyrie if you want a different style of control deck, or Black Panther if you're really into the on-reveal style of decks. I don't think these are a bad buy at the current price, but I do think it might not be a bad idea to wait for them to rotate down to Pool 3 and save those 3,000 tokens for other Pool 5 cards that move down. So overall, B tier cards, pretty good cards. I think the ceiling on these cards is pretty high, but the context of the current metagame means they are not really top tier cards right now, though they might have potential to be that in the future. However, by the time that comes around, when more cards are introduced, they will probably be in Pool 3. Now, we don't have an exact timetable of which cards are rotating down from Pool 4 to Pool 3, because not all the initial Pool 4 cards rotated down. We still have cards like the ones we're going to talk about now in C tier, Agent Coulson, Maria Hill, M'Baku. These cards initially launched in Pool 4, and I would imagine these are going to be the cards that rotate down to Pool 3 before the more recent additions such as Bast and Valkyrie. So looking at C tier here, C tier these are cards that improve existing archetypes or are decent, can be added into these existing archetypes, but they are not archetypes that rely on these cards to be successful. Agent Coulson and Maria Hill kind of fall into the same category here of Devil Dinosaur style decks. If Dino's something you're really into and you like playing and you want some more options to toy around with, these are pretty good cards to add to that style of deck. Now, are they necessarily the best cards to play in a Dino deck? I'm not super sure about that. I think Coulson definitely has a bit more potential in that regard, but I think they are fun cards and they can create a more varied style of gameplay by giving you access to things you wouldn't normally include in your deck when deck building. That said, I would not recommend buying any of these cards at the current price, but if you happen to open them, they aren't necessarily useless. M'Baku might seem a little controversial here because this card has been very heavily memed on, especially if you haven't seen it yet. The little no room for M'Baku pop-up that happens when M'Baku is in your deck and actually has no room to pop himself out onto the field at the end of the game. Though I do think M'Baku does have a place and does fall into that category that makes him C tier of there is an existing deck that does appreciate this kind of effect, and that deck would be Lockjaw. I do think the best version of Lockjaw is the Thanos version, but obviously being a pool 5 card, that's not a card everybody has access to. So because of that, the other best Lockjaw deck, if you don't have access to these pool 5 cards, is the Thor Lockjaw deck with Jane and Thor and some other big stuff. And M'Baku kind of makes quite a bit of sense in that deck because you have a way of tossing this card back into your deck to get him out later, and you get a benefit in potentially pulling out a bigger thing or Thor's hammer, etc. So I do think this card has a place, and I do think he has a function. On top of that, he does have some niche application in Cerebro 2, where if he does stay in your deck, he can pop out at the end for a little bit of added bonus, but I don't think that's too practical of an application, as it's not going to happen very often in many of your games. So this is one where if you happen to open it, cool, maybe you can try it out in the Lockjaw Thor stuff, but doesn't really seem to have much of a home outside of that currently. Moving on to our last and final tier here, D tier. These are cards that have a very niche application, and I wouldn't even remotely ever consider spending tokens on, but there are sometimes some things you can do with them if you do happen to acquire them naturally through your collection level. These are all rated in order of best to worst, in my opinion. So it's not just a random order here. Starting off with Attuma. Attuma has some niche applications currently. The main shells that seek to utilize this card, sometimes he makes the cut in big decks, but I don't really think he is necessarily optimal there, though he's not the worst card in the world. But the places where this card really does see a bit of play are the ongoing decks. Classic Ongoing Destroyer doesn't really mind using this card, as you have ways to protect it with armor to mitigate the downside. Another benefit in that shell is you can go Attuma on an empty lane into Professor X to prevent the destroy effect, so that's a pretty nice upside. And there is a neat interaction where if you pop this card behind Invisible Woman, he won't actually check his effect because the effect checks at the end of the turn, and Invisible Woman reveals cards at the end of the game, so there is no end turn check. So Attuma kind of makes sense in those kind of shells, but even there, I don't think it's necessarily a card you need to play those decks, but if you're looking for somewhere to play it, those are probably the places you want to play this card. Helicarrier. This card got a little bit of a boost with the most recently released Season Pass card, MODOK. Before, Helicarrier was, I think, the worst Pool 4 card in the game, at least before Orca was introduced. And the reason for that was Hela doesn't really want this, and regular discard didn't really want this. And at that point, what's the point of this card existing? Because it's just a 6/10 with not relevant text for anything outside of a discard deck. I have seen a few people try it in a Dino shell with a Sif Ghost Rider package, and that's kind of a cute usage of it, but it is by no means the better way to build a dinosaur deck. You are seeing people experiment with it a little bit post MODOK release, as being able to discard your hand, pump your Morbius, get cards back in your hand so you can continue discarding is pretty alright, but it really isn't exceptional, and it really doesn't have too much of a home outside of there. Super Scroll. This is a card with a super neat effect, and unfortunately it was probably the worst Series 5 card when the first batch of them released, but it's since moved down. And unfortunately, the application of this card is always going to be very meta dependent. And I think in terms of at least playing on ladder, it's just way too niche to ever find a consistent home in a deck. Though sometimes there will be new and hot locations where you can probably take advantage of this card, such as the recent Washington, D.C. If you're expecting a lot of Patriot decks, this can be kind of funny to slot in your deck for the mirror, or the other recent one, Onslaught Citadel, where you know people are going to be playing ongoing stuff. The problem with this card, though, is that you have no way of knowing if your opponent is going to be playing an ongoing deck. So unless ongoing is like a majority of the meta, Super Scroll is often, for cost, 2 power, do nothing. And the other thing is, it doesn't even take away the benefit from the opponent. So your opponent probably has synergies for their ongoing cards. A great example of this is a card like Darkhawk. If our opponent is playing a Darkhawk deck and they have ways of making our deck bigger, if we just copy their Darkhawk effect, we don't have ways of kind of getting that payoff to work correctly because our deck isn't built around it. So we aren't stopping them from advancing their game plan, and often we are copying it in a deck that's not really designed for the benefits of whatever those effects are. So Super Scroll, pretty bad card for that reason, and will, I think, forever be a very situational tech card that is kind of rough to use on ladder, just because there's going to be a lot of time when it either does nothing, or what it does in copying the opponent's stuff isn't leveraged to the full extent of whatever ongoing abilities it's copying or trying to accomplish. Last, and definitely least in this instance, is Orca. Orca is, this card was actually supposed to drop with the initial Series 4, but due to a bug, it only became available a bit more recently. But Orca is the Namor of Pool 4. He's just really bad and really boring. I tried to make him work in a ongoing Destroyer deck, and he can kind of work there. He's not the worst thing in the world, but ultimately, paying 6 energy to get, at best, 14 power just isn't really very good. And then the fact that we have to fall into a specific condition of him being the only thing in a lane makes it even worse. It's 14 power often is not going to be enough to win a lane on its own, and you can't pair him up with other things because then he loses the only reason you're playing him and just becomes a worse America Chavez. It's not a good card. I wish it was. I wish there was a better way to make it work, but the only thing I've seen for this card is the ongoing Destroyer Shell, and even there, I think it's probably a suboptimal choice. So those are all the Pool 4 cards and what I think about them and kind of where they currently find a home. To reiterate, in terms of buying stuff in Pool 4, I think the one card that is a pretty easy buy right now is Shuri, because she really enables some super powerful stuff, but currently her play rate is kind of limited to one main deck, so you want to see if you have the cards to make that deck work before you commit to her. But if you do, she's a super easy buy. Then B tier cards are cards that if you're looking for other decks to play and these playstyles seem appealing to you, they aren't bad choices, though I do not expect them to result in any tier 1 deck with the current available cards, but you never know, sometimes that changes. But if you really like the effect and are looking for a new deck to play, all 3 of these cards really provide a unique effect that the deck they go into doesn't really work the same without. And then everything C and D tier below is just an insta-pass, wouldn't even remotely consider buying, just kind of getting them as you progress or getting them as they rotate down to Pool 3. So those are my thoughts. That's our tier list and buyer's guide for Pool 4. We'll be having one of these up on Pool 5 soon, so keep an eye out for that. But let me know what you think about these cards in the comments below. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.